Remember, there is always only one truth. You get to know that by following and subscribing.
So, I have a confession. I'm an academic. That's bad enough, I know. I wasn't always, obviously, but I've always had a creative approach to studying and to research. As an errant teenager, I spent a lot of time in school skiving off and bunking off down to the local second-hand bookshop where I'd read everything I could get my hands on the esoteric and left field science. I developed a kind of passion for what we might call exceptional human experience, altered states of consciousness, and psychedelics later on as well. I wanted to extend that interest in study and went off to university to try and understand these experiences through the lens of psychology. I did a degree, I'd spent 3 years, and I learned a lot about Western psychology, but I learned almost nothing about altered states of consciousness and exceptional experience. Then something unprecedented happened. One of my university lecturers for my degree asked me back to teach. I was terrified. Suddenly I found myself on the pointy end of the classroom. And that went well for a while. As I was commuting into central London one day on the train, I had what you might call an epiphany, this kind of aha moment. And it suddenly dawned on me what I needed to do. And that was to give up my job and go to Mexico and study shamanism. So I told this to my colleague who'd given me the job, and of course she was horrified. She said, if you go to Mexico and study shamanism, you'll go mad and you won't come back. That was 20 years ago. I've been at the University of Greenwich for 11 years, so I came back. I'm just not sure about the other bit. So I set off to Mexico, and I knew virtually nothing about the country, and even less about shamanism. I've managed to learn a little bit. I'm going to tell you about what I think I know about it now. So shamans are people who go into an altered state of consciousness at will in the name of their community to communicate with the spirits of nature and to transcend time and space and bring back useful information for their community. It's quite a big job. They do this through various techniques, be it through dreaming or drumming or diet or dancing or through drugs. But they don't call them drugs. They call them medicines, or they call them plant teachers or plant allies. In our parlance, the drugs they're referring to, or we're referring to, we call psychedelics. So I've had a long interest in the use of these psychedelics in a shamanic context. And the use of these substances goes back thousands of years on all parts of the planet, on every continent of the globe. We find shamans who make use of certain psychoactive plants, such as the huicholes in Mexico, who use the peyote cactus containing mescaline. Also in Mexico, with the Mazatec, make use of this psilocybin-containing magic mushrooms. Other magic mushroom use we find in Siberia and northern Canada with this Amanita muscaria, beloved of children's fairy tales. Other parts of the world, such as India, we find the use of datura, or maybe patchouli in Australia, or maybe iboga in Africa, or Syrian rue in the Middle East. And of course, in the Amazon, we have a veritable cornucopia of various psychoactive psychedelic substances, such as ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is a kind of interesting one. And when it was originally isolated for its constituent chemicals about 100 years ago, they named one of the chemicals in it telepathine, on account of the fact that all the explorers and ethnobotanists who had encountered the use of this substance had had telepathic-like visions. And I was curious about that. Is it then that people other than shamans can have these experiences of transcending time and space? So I started doing my first bit of research. I did a survey and asked contemporary modern day psychedelic users whether or not they'd had any of these kinds of experiences. And what I discovered was that 50% of people had taken a psychedelic substance had had an experience of telepathy under the influence of that substance. That's quite an astonishing amount of people. If you compare that, for instance, to people using non-psychedelic substances like maybe heroin or alcohol or coffee or cocaine, people don't report having experiences of telepathy with those substances. So there's something very specific to psychedelics that induce these kinds of experiences. But are they real? Are they in any way genuine? we have to apply the lens of science and look at these experiences within a controlled laboratory conditions to see if these effects are in any way genuine. So my research over the years, I've done a lot of experimental studies on precognition. So precognition is one of those apparent experiences where you can transcend time and get information back from the future without recourse to your usual sensory experience or through the means of inference. So I applied my research from precognition and wanted to take it into the psychedelic realm. So the thing about precognition and the study of it and the field of parapsychology more generally, it's been around for about 140 years and it's always been quite taboo. It's always been on the outside of the academy, or at least on the edge. So I wanted to take that study and apply the study of psychedelics to that as well. And the thing about psychedelics is they've always been in this area of taboo research until very recently, neither of which attract very much funding. And so I did the unthinkable. I took two career suicide fields and I joined them together and committed double career harry-carry. So first of all, I went to Brazil. I applied my precognition research to the use of ayahuasca in Christian syncretic churches, which makes use of an extremely potent jungle hallucinogen. Those experiments could have changed the world. However, it turns out my methodology wasn't very good, but there's no such thing as a failed experiment. And so I learned from that. I changed my design, my methodology, and this time I set off again for Ecuador. Having studied ayahuasca, I turned my attention to San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline, much like peyote. So I wanted to do something similar to my previous experiment, where I'd managed to get 20 participants and get them to perform my precognition task, one trial each under the influence. I spent most of my time, however, on a limited budget, traveling around Ecuador trying to find a shaman who would let me do my experiments in their ceremony. I eventually found one and I thought, this is it, I'm going to make history. And I pulled out my laptop and he said, no, you're going to scare off all the spirits with your electromagnetic juju. And that was the end of that bit of research, or so I thought. I didn't want to go home empty-handed with no data. And so I figured, instead of getting 20 people to do my experiment, one trial each, if I just get one person to do all 20 trials, it's effectively the same thing. And so I did, and that was me. So this is how I find myself doing this experiment. And the experiment goes like this. There's 4 stages to it. There's a visualization, then a viewing, then a voting, and then a verification. Anything beginning with V, basically. So in the visualization stage, under the influence of mescaline, I would merely close my eyes, and within all the enhanced mental imagery that the drug induces, I tried to visualize the future target, whatever that might be. And all I knew was that it would be a 1-minute video clip drawn randomly from some film or other. When I'd got my visualization, I would write it down, something concrete I could actually describe, and then I'd go on to the viewing stage. And I would see 4 pre-prepared, randomized 1-minute video clips that were all very different from each other. And I'd view each one, but I wouldn't know what the target was. One of them would be chosen later as the target. And then I'd say, well, my visualization was perhaps maybe a little bit like the Matrix scene, a smidging of that thing, of the overview effect, virtually nothing like Rick and Morty, and maybe a smattering of Mary Poppins. And so then I'll be able to rank these different video clips according to which one I thought my visualization was the most like. I'd done my voting. And finally, the final stage would be the verification. And to do that, a random number generator would be invoked to produce the actual target. The random number generator would decide which one of these 4 clips would be the future target. So I'm going to give you some of my cherry-picked results before I tell you the actual answer. That is me high on San Pedro cactus, I presume. That isn't the results. So this was my very first go. I didn't record the data from this. I just attempted to see if I could actually perform well in this experiment under these circumstances. And this is my visualization. An ancient Greek scene, eyes, a city at night on a lake. And this was one of the 4 clips, well, the first one I saw. Well, I could show that all day. When the clip ended after a minute, I found myself gripping the table, wondering what was going to happen next and wondering why the clip had finished. And then I looked down and I saw what I'd written a few moments earlier, ancient Greek scene, which I found to be somewhat encouraging. So I carried on with the experiment. I did a whole 20 trials, and I'll cherry pick you some of the best examples. This is one I particularly like, which is very clear and direct, very simple. Desert, dunes, the sands of time. And this is one of the 4 clips which I thought was most similar to my visualization. Desert dunes, the sands of time. And there you have it. But the important thing is, but what did the computer decide was the target? And of course, when I ran the random number generator, on this occasion, the computer also said, yes, that is the target. Now, they weren't always as direct as that, because that'd be terrifying and astonishing in equal measure. They're often much more vague. Often there would be, when I got it right, it would be on a thematic basis. So there'd be elements of my visualization which would be reflected in one of the video clips, and I would choose. And this one highlights that particularly. So this is my visualization, rotating like helicopter blades, space, more mechanical stuff, spacecraft, space skeletons, and then a slightly different vision, water, a submarine, a big rig, but underwater. So something mechanical kind of floating. And this is the clip out of the 4 that I happened to choose.
I think I just blasted it.
They're coming through!
Spacecraft, anybody? I mean, this is Star Wars. Space, more mechanical stuff. I mean, it doesn't get more mechanical than the Death Star, does it? I mean, it's a whole mechanical thing the size of a planet. And how about space skeletons? Do you think George Lucas, when he was designing the Stormtroopers, was like, yeah, we want to have some kind of futuristic skeletons, you know, robot-looking guys? And then finally, what about the helicopter blades? Well, here we see Luke fumbling around in his utility belt, pulling out something that's going to save them. What is it? Some kind of grappling hook, maybe, swinging it around. We get a closer inspection of it, and we finally see it looks like helicopter blades. So that for me was it. I didn't see his sister kissing him though, unfortunately. My precognitive powers under the influence of mescaline were not that good. So you get the general idea. And finally, after the end of 20 trials, I managed to score much better than chance. It was at a 40% hit rate. Ultimately, that was significant, whereas we'd only expect 25% by chance. Now, that doesn't sound like anything astronomical, which it isn't, and it's only one experiment, so this isn't conclusive. This is just the start of a research paradigm. This is essentially a proof of process that it may be possible to do this kind of research. I've since repeated the experiment with other people, not just myself this time, under the influence of LSD, and another group of people under the influence of a drug called dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is probably the most potent psychedelic known to humanity. And I'm going to publish those results very soon. Meanwhile, I've embarked on a new project, not just looking at precognition, but also telepathy, and having 2 people having the DMT experience at the same time, looking at seeing whether they can have a shared visionary experience, whereby they have similar content to their visionary episode. So I've dedicated my whole career. Probably I'm the kind of a solo career, doesn't seem to be anyone else doing this research, curiously. And I've tried to apply the techniques of psychedelic parapsychology to the science of shamanism. And I think it has potentially important implications, not just for understanding the nature of consciousness, but also perhaps the nature of time and maybe the nature of reality itself. Thank you very much.
As a kid, I'd always joked with my friends and family about being born in the wrong generation. I'm a child of the 60s, I would say, a modern hippie. I listened to Jimi Hendrix and the Grateful Dead. I wore tie-dye shirts and had hair down to my shoulders. To my teenage self, the 1960s seemed like a vibrant age of creativity and free expression, a time of novel ideas fueled by hallucinogenic drugs that challenged the norm and questioned the status quo. And at that point in my life, there were 2 possible life outcomes: to either become a traveling musician in a rock and roll band, or to pitch a tent in the wilderness and live off the land. Well, I gave both of those things a real shot and made the most of them while they lasted. But at some point, my hippie dreams faded, and they were replaced with more traditional goals, like a career, a salary, and a home that wasn't made out of nylon fabric. It wasn't until making the transition to graduate school here at Michigan when I realized the potential connection between my teenage dreams and a real job. In 2015, I was introduced to psychedelic research in this article by Michael Pollan in The New Yorker. He described how researchers had given magic mushrooms to patients with life-threatening cancer in an effort to reduce their anxiety surrounding death. And the overwhelmingly positive results of that study helped fuel what is now being called the psychedelic renaissance, a rebirth of the substances that played such an integral role in what made the 1960s so unique were now legitimate topics of study in science. And at that moment, I said to myself, far out, man. And I started looking for PhD programs in psychedelic science. But before we get too off track, let's make sure we understand what this psychedelic renaissance is all about. The word psychedelic is derived from the Greek word psyche, meaning mind, and delos, meaning to make visible. Psychedelic thus translates to mind manifesting, or to reveal the mind. And psychedelics make up a class of drugs that reliably and drastically alter human consciousness, or free your mind, as they might have said in the 1960s. And the classic psychedelics include substances like LSD, magic mushrooms, and DMT. This renaissance of psychedelic research is showing us that psychedelics are able to ease symptoms of depression and anxiety for months in individuals who were previously thought to be treatment resistant. Many participants in these studies attest that their psychedelic experiences are among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire lives, on par with the birth of a child or death of a family member. So today, the substances that freed the minds of an entire generation in the 1960s are now helping to free the minds of individuals with crippling mental health conditions. But as you might guess, psychedelics can also free the mind of healthy individuals too. And the psychedelic renaissance is revealing to us that these substances are extraordinary tools for scientists like me to study the mind and understand the mechanisms of consciousness itself. In order to understand how psychedelics can be useful here, we first have to attempt to understand consciousness, which is a big challenge, not just for you and me, but for all of science. Because collectively, science lacks an explanation for how the molecules, cells, and organs of our body synergistically combine to generate this all-encompassing experience that we call consciousness. And it's not just our mind's eye. Consciousness is the essence of what it means to be human. It is the stage for any and all experiences that will ever happen in our entire lives. And without it, everything we know ceases to exist. Yet despite its fundamental importance, the mysteries of consciousness remain as the ultimate unsolved mystery of science. So where do psychedelics fit in? Well, as a scientist, you learn that a good way to improve your understanding of something is to alter it. And psychedelics are among the most powerful tools for altering consciousness that we know of. With modern neuroscience tools, we can now measure exactly what's happening in the brain of an individual over the course of a controlled but radical shift in consciousness. And this shift in consciousness is also coupled with a profound, meaningful, and personal subjective experience. So we now have the ability to precisely quantify the physiological and neurological changes that are associated with this intensely subjective altered state, which provides a fascinating new path towards studying consciousness in entirely new ways. Longtime researcher Dr. Stanislav Grof once said, "Psychedelics are for the mind what the microscope is for biology and the telescope is for astronomy." He was suggesting that psychedelics, like the microscope or telescope, have the potential to reveal realms of reality that were previously invisible to the naked eye. They provide a powerful lens for us to study and examine the mind in entirely new ways. But what if our bodies readily and naturally produced its own psychedelic substance? Might you be interested in how that substance relates to consciousness? Well, for the last several decades, scientists have known that to be true. Your body, my body, and all mammals for that matter, naturally produce a psychedelic substance called N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. DMT is a small molecule in our body whose molecular structure is incredibly similar to the structure of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And the fascinating thing is that even though we know so much about how critical serotonin is for the regulation of mood and brain function, science knows next to nothing about the role that DMT might be playing in the body. And what's more, DMT seems to be nearly ubiquitous in nature. Not only is it present across the animal kingdom, DMT is naturally produced by hundreds, if not thousands, of species of plants. And when I first learned that, my inner flower child transcended. So that's where I come back. My dreams of becoming a traveling hippie and selling out music festivals didn't exactly pan out. But I found a job researching psychedelics and studying one of the most fascinating topics I could have ever imagined. My PhD work is focused on the study of DMT in the body and the role that it may play in brain function and consciousness. In other words, what is this psychedelic compound doing floating around in our body? And can it provide clues as to the mysteries of the mind? To answer that, we should look at how DMT affects consciousness. When taken in its pure form, DMT brings about altered states of consciousness reminiscent of other psychedelics. Visual hallucinations, distortions of reality, altered perception of time and space. But the DMT experience is said to exist in an entirely separate domain relative to those of the other psychedelics. Within usually less than 30 seconds of DMT ingestion, the user is catapulted through a visually immersive, kaleidoscopic labyrinth of vibrant and shifting geometry, and then plunged into a seemingly alternate and otherworldly dimension, a realm of space that was previously unfathomable to the mind. And this coincides with the feeling of complete and utter disembodiment from the physical self, oftentimes forgetting that their body even exists. And during that brief stint in this alien realm, users report communication with higher intelligences, confrontations with death, and an overwhelming feeling of the experience being more real than real. But within a matter of about 10 minutes, the effects will have almost completely subsided, and normal waking consciousness resumes. So that just begs the question. If that's what happens when we consume DMT, then what in the world is it doing in our body? Early guesses propose that DMT might act as a schizotoxin, or substance responsible for the hallucinatory effects of schizophrenia. Other guesses suggested that DMT might be involved in dreaming consciousness, states of spiritual or religious mysticism, or near-death experiences. Our work here at Michigan is aiming to not only understand the brain effects of the DMT experience, but also to understand the basic role that DMT might play in day-to-day physiological functions. But the short answer is, science currently has almost no grasp about what DMT might be doing in the body. But the fact that it's withstood generations of human evolution and remained a part of our own physiology to this day suggests that it's here for a reason. And of all the psychedelics being investigated for their consciousness-altering effects and therapeutic benefits, DMT is the most widespread in nature, and the only psychedelic known to be endogenous to humans, or naturally produced by us. And since it's produced by us, it may be a part of a yet undiscovered natural hallucinogenic system within our body, a system that becomes activated at certain times to regulate perception or bring about altered states of consciousness. Or perhaps this system plays some role in our ability to receive or experience the effects of other psychedelics, like LSD or magic mushrooms. Or perhaps DMT is in fact involved in our normal perception of reality, and its dysfunction contributes to psychiatric hallucinatory disorders. All of these are possible, but nothing is yet proven. But I believe that the mystery of DMT deserves the attention of scientists, philosophers, psychologists, therapists, and anyone interested in trying to make sense of the situation we call reality. So I'd now like to summarize with a quote by the founder of American psychology, William James, who over a century ago advocated for the importance of studying altered states of consciousness. He said that our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. Through self-experimentation, William James realized that the reality we're currently experiencing, waking reality, is merely a fraction of possible conscious states that exist. And if we prevent ourselves from studying these altered states of consciousness, we will never have a complete understanding of the universe. The psychedelic renaissance is revealing to us the vast amount of power and potential that psychedelics have. And the presence of naturally occurring DMT in the body represents a great unsolved mystery and a tangible link between altered states of consciousness and human physiology. So I suggest we take the advice of William James. Let's adopt the psychedelic experience as a tool to study consciousness. And let's determine if DMT, the only psychedelic known to be produced by humans, plays a role in the most fundamental and important mystery of science, human consciousness. Thank you.
Good evening. One of the things I love about visiting indigenous cultures is it lets me step back in time and see how we all lived centuries ago. And in doing that, I've noticed so many things that we've gained and things that we've lost. And one of the things I've really noticed is the fact that our relationships are much different. And first of all, our relationship to the land. In indigenous cultures, there's no grocery store. In tribal cultures especially, no utility districts, no water districts, no fast food restaurants. Nothing stands between them and their survival other than their own ingenuity and their own knowledge of the earth. And they have a very intimate knowledge of the earth. And it's always astonished me. This one Hawaiian woman was at the beach, and I met her, and she saw this crab flipping out sand out of the hole, and she said, the sand's going to the north. There'll be a Kona storm tomorrow. And sure enough, a Kona storm shows up tomorrow. So their knowledge, they're more or less the PhDs of their place on the planet. The other relationship that I've noticed is so tight is their relationship to each other. Again, they don't have the institutions. They don't have Social Security. They don't have an IRA or 401k plan. They don't have elder care facilities. They completely depend on each other for their survival again. And that produces a real tightness. I've noticed women at a well in Africa, for instance, and they're all sitting around joking and talking. They're nursing their babies, and the woman that needs to go to get the water will take her baby and pass it to another woman. She'll start nursing it. That woman will see her goat run off, and she'll pass the baby to a third woman, and she'll start nursing it. So these kids are kind of even raised communally. They live in extended families, and that brings a real tightness. The other relationship that I want to talk about tonight is the relationship to spirit. And it's a very strong one. So this is Malik and her great-granddaughter, Yasmina. And they spend all their time together, 14 hours a day working in the garden. And I've seen this in Africa, Asia, South America. And I ask, why are these two people that are so different together all the time? And this big age difference. And they said, no, you don't understand. Yasmina is just about coming out of the spirit world, and Malik is just about to go back into the spirit world. So they really do have the most in common. And they literally pray to the spirits of the forests, the mountains, the rivers. They put spirits in everything. Their ancestor spirits are so important to them. So in the beginning, I sort of looked at this as superstition, uneducated, naive thinking, And over the last 30 years, I've slowly changed, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how that change came about. So about 25 years ago, I was doing a project in Tibet on the human rights issue there, and I had the opportunity to go and meet the medium, the channels, the oracle of Tibet, the Dalai Lama's oracle. And it took place in this little monastery. And there were about 60 monks in there. They led the medium in, sat him down, put this big hat on his head, and a very heavy hat. His face turned kind of red. The monks started chanting and beating their drums. And he kind of went into this trance. And he started talking in a real high-pitched voice. And the monks started writing down everything he was saying. And then, after about 5 minutes of that, he fainted, and they literally had to carry him out of the room. And I just watched this, and I was wondering, is this a performance? Did he have a heart attack? But 2 days later, I was able to interview the medium. His name is Tuptim. He was 30 years old at the time. He's 50 now. And he said that he didn't remember a thing that he said when he was in this trance. And he felt very weak right afterwards, for a day afterwards. And so I said, well, how did you become the medium? And how did you get this job? And he said, you know, when I was younger, I had started hearing these voices. And I started feeling very ill. And I was very confused. In fact, I thought I was dying at one point. And an older monk came to me and said, hey, you've got a gift. And he taught me how to go in and out of trance. He nurtured me. He stayed with me for the whole year. And now he is the Dalai Lama's oracle, the oracle of Tibet. So 2 years later, I was doing a project for Amnesty International up in the northern part of Kenya in the Samburu area. And I was taking pictures of these people, and my guide turned to me and said, you know, their predictor has told them that you were coming to take pictures of them. And I didn't think too much about that because there I was taking pictures of them. But he went on to say, he said, they also said that she said that you would hide from them when you took their picture. And I said, no, I don't hide. I'm right in front. I use very short lenses. I'm usually right in front of the person when I take their portrait. And that night I was home cleaning my lenses, packing my bags, and I realized, yeah, I had brought my new camera that I'd never used before. It's this panoramic camera. And this is the way I've got to focus that in total darkness. So all of a sudden I thought, well, that's a coincidence. My assistant said, that's amazing. So it was just something we kind of filed away. But I, at that point, decided what I wanted to do is start actually seeking out these people that go into altered states of consciousness in order to heal or predict for their tribes. And that's what I started doing. And so, by the way, here is the woman that was the predictor. And I did take her picture with the panoramic camera. Her name is Sekulin. She's 37 years old, or was at the time, 5 kids. And she had the very same story as the medium of the Dalai Lama. When she was 12 years old, she started having visual hallucinations. She started feeling sick and dizzy. And her grandmother came and said, you know, you've got a talent. And she nurtured her through it. So I literally went around the world and doing my human rights work and started finding these shaman. And the way I would find them, they never introduced themselves as shaman. You would never know who they were unless you asked the community members, who's the healer here, who goes into trance, and they would tell me and lead me to the person. So this is Namid. She's a Mongolian shaman. I'll just show you some of the 40 I interviewed. This is Morgan Yazi. He's a Navajo medicine man. This is Linza. She's a shaman in Siberia, eastern Siberia. Mingatui, a shaman in the Rawani tribe in Ecuador, in the Amazon in Ecuador. And one of the last shaman I interviewed was right on the Pakistan-Afghan border. There's a group of animists there called the Kalash. And there's only 3,000 of them left. And they're surrounded by Islam. And they hold on to their animistic beliefs. And they're very interesting looking. They're blonde-haired, blue-eyed. They say they're the remnants of Alexander the Great's army. And they're very fun-loving. They make their own wine. But I went there because I was told that there was a 6-year-old boy that was being initiated to be a shaman, and I wanted to see him. So, because everybody I had interviewed up to that point had been a shaman for years, so I wanted to find somebody in that process of initiation. So when I got there, I found, no, he wasn't 6 years old. He was a 60-year-old goat herder up in the mountains. So that's the shaman rumor mill. But anyway, I had taken my 16-year-old son with me as an assistant, and we had to hike for about a day and a half to get up to the top of the mountain where John Dooley Khan here was herding his goats, and he was the shaman for the Kalash people. And again, I asked the same questions. How did you get into this? What do you do for your tribe? He had the same story of hallucinations, being mentored by an older shaman. And the shaman in different cultures induce their trance in different ways. By the way, shamanism is a universal practice. It's the world's oldest spiritual practice. And there's a lot of common denominators. But the way they go into trance can differ. In Mongolia, they beat a drum next to their ear. In South America, they take psychoactive plants like ayahuasca. In Pakistan, they did something that was quite unique. They burn juniper branches. They slaughter an animal, pour the blood over the burning branches, and then the shaman inhales the smoke to go into trance. And so here I'm trying to talk him out of doing a ceremony for me because I don't want him to kill one of his animals. And he said, no, I have to do it. My spirits are telling me I have to do it. You've come so far. So the next morning, his son started the fire, started burning the juniper branches, and he started praying to the mountain spirits, the spirits of the forests. And they slaughtered the animal, and he started inhaling the smoke, and then he went into trance. And he stayed into trance for about 5 or 10 minutes. And when he came out, he was very silent. He hardly said anything. And he was very talkative before he went into trance, and I thought, well, this is kind of strange. And I asked one of his sons, through my interpreter, what happened to him? What did he say? Did he see anything? And the son just said, the only thing he said is, your journey is going to be extremely difficult, but you're going to be safe. And that's all he said. So the next day, my son and I took off. We left his campment and walked down the mountain and headed up further into the Hindu Kush mountains. And we were out in the middle of nowhere. We had a Jeep, and my son started getting sick. And he evidently picked up a bug in the water around John Dooley Khan's camp. And the first day went by, couldn't keep anything down. Second day, third day, fourth day, couldn't keep anything down for 4 days. And he was getting so weak he could hardly walk. And I was totally freaked out. We pulled into this little village, and we happened to run into a doctor from Islamabad who was visiting his mother, and he happened to have a bag of glucose and saline and an IV drip and some oral hydration salts, and we brought Dax around. And it was to me, it was like a miracle that that whole thing happened. But, so I'll tell you a little bit about the shaman. First of all, this is the common things with shamanism. It's not always true, but in general. They typically are identified with what they call the call. And the call, in the ones I interviewed, almost all of them, it was a psychological crisis. Secondly, they almost always have a mentor, somebody that's been through it and come out the other end of this psychological crisis and can show them the ropes and show them and tell them and comfort them along the way. And then they have to face what they call the initiation, and it's almost always this death, a death of their old self and a rebirth of a new self. And this rebirth, I don't know how to explain it. It's like they take on much more of an elevated consciousness. They expand their consciousness. Their awareness of who they are expands. They expand their circle of compassion. I guess that'd be the quickest way to say it. And as such, they learn to go into the spirit world where they believe the spirit world informs our world of reality here. So that's where things really happen. So they go there, get the information, come back to help people. And then, after they've learned their trade, they begin their life of service, either a healer, a seer, a priest. And they typically do this for no money. I mean, this is something they just do. It's just something added to what they do. And in the beginning, many of them resist it because, like John Dulikan, he's still a goat herder. He still has to do that. But on top of that, he's the healer for the community. Sekulin has 5 kids that she has to take care of. On top of that, she's the healer of her community. So it is a lot of extra work. So it happened, I put that whole project aside because I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to say about it. I felt I was getting in over my head into this world of consciousness and spirits and all this. But a year and a half ago, I met a young kid who had one of these psychological breaks. I just want to introduce you to him just a moment here.
It was just this total shattering, and my mind just opened, and I started thinking of all these different things. And in that sense, it was beautiful. I found it was how I found the first time I had ever experienced a real connection to the universe, where I really felt like a part of this, that I was this was me. It was just like incredible. And so yeah, just absolutely amazing. And then I kept going. And then I went way too far. And then it got scary. It was just kind of like a panic, I don't know, put some medication in this kid and just hope for the best. But I don't know if it hurt or helped. It was at the point where I was being diagnosed, I think, for side effects of medications. Like there was a point where I was taking 15 pills in a day. And just, like, I felt like a lab rat. And the side effects were just awful, absolutely awful. Yeah. No, vomiting all day. I couldn't leave my house for so long from just like these awful anxiety attacks, and like the thought of interacting with people would make me sick to my stomach. It was just so much. And I still don't know. I don't know what was a side effect and what was my mind.
So Adam was on drugs, on pharmaceuticals for about 4 years. And he was having such a hard time that he decided to go cold turkey, cut him off, and did a Vipassana meditation retreat. And for those of you who don't know what that is, they come in various forms, but this one was 10 days, silent meditation, 10 hours a day. It's very rigorous. I did one just to see what it was about, and it was one of the harder things I did. And he was able to stabilize himself. And he got a job at Whole Foods Market, which he hadn't been able to do before. And he started having what he called synchronicities, where he'd have a thought and the thing would happen. And by the way, he's very psychic. He has very strong healing potentials. But he has no confidence in what's happening to him. There's no one that's been able to conceptualize it for him. Anyway, he had these, and he decided he needed to go back and do another Vipassana. Well, they learned that he had this history of mental illness, and they sent him home. So the one avenue that he could have gotten relief from cut him off because of the stigma of his mental illness. So Adam isn't alone in this, by the way. There's, in having bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, any of these heavy psychological episodes. Here's some statistics from the National Institute of Mental Health. 1 in 5 of us will suffer a psychological crisis in our lifetime. And by the way, that's a rising figure right now. The other thing is 1 in 20 will become disabled because of it. And another interesting fact about this phenomena is 50% happens before the age of 14. By the way, most of the shaman, it happened either in their adolescence or in their teenage years. 75% before the age of 24. So it's more or less a phenomena of young people. So here's the difference in cultures that I notice. The shaman's advantage. One, they have a cultural context. The physiological crisis, although it's difficult, it's believed to be, they put it in a positive light. It's something the person's going to come out of and be stronger in the end and have more abilities in the end. The other thing that's a big advantage is it's not stigmatized. I mean, if you have the stamp of mental illness on your forehead or on your dossier or whatever, you're not going to get a job. It's not like having diabetes or even cancer. It's one of the most stigmatized things that can happen to the person in our culture. And especially if some kid is having these visions and he's not knowing what's happening to him, and the doctor comes and says, you're broken and you are this, you can imagine how that adds to the problem. So the other thing they have an advantage of, they have a mentor. They have somebody that's been through this process that can take and hold their hand and say, listen, I know what this is all about, and this is how you manage it. And the third thing that's a huge advantage is they have a community that buys into what they've gone through. And not only that, they have an outlet for their talents. And many of these people have specific talents that the normal person doesn't have. So that's what is an advantage if you're in one of these indigenous communities. I don't know if you heard the recent TED Talk by a woman by the name of Eleanor Longden. Has anybody heard that one? It went viral. She did it a couple of months ago. This is a young woman. When she went to college, she started hearing voices. And she said, my nightmare began when I told my roommate I was hearing voices. The roommate said, you better see a doctor. So she went and saw the doctor. The doctor said, you better see a psychiatrist. She went to see the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist gave her the label, schizophrenia, put her on medications. By the way, these medications suppress the symptoms. They don't get at the root problem. And she said, from that point on, she just spiraled down. You ought to listen to her video on how she brought herself out of that. And she eventually got to the point where she said, I realized that those voices were helping me resolve this old childhood trauma of sexual molestation. But it took her and a couple of friends that believed in her to get her out of that hole that she had gone down in because of that stigma. So if you do have one of these issues, if one of us does have one of these issues, we go to somebody. The common method of treatment is to suppress the symptoms with pharmaceuticals. So with Adam, we've been following him on, and so I've been posting this on our blog over the last year and a half, how he's doing and what's going on. By the way, he's homeless now, like so many end up. And we've started interviewing professionals that take a whole different approach to this problem. And in fact, some of the psychiatrists, psychologists we've interviewed, and we're posting them as well, like to label many of these instances, not all of them, but many of them, as spiritual emergencies. And they believe, just like I do now, if you hold these people, if you don't stigmatize them, if you don't scare them with a label and tell them they're broken, and if you give them a place of support, that the psyche itself is self-healing, it will take them and it will eventually work out whatever is going on with them, and they'll typically come out at a higher level of awareness and consciousness that they went into the problem in the first place. There are many people that believe, that we've interviewed, cultural historians, cultural anthropologists, that believe that our species right now is in crisis. You look at the environment, you look at the economic system, you look at what's happening with our continual wars, and we're being asked to raise our consciousness to a whole different level. And so I just want to end with this statement from one of our most famous scientists, and I love this statement. He says, or this quote, "We human beings tend to experience ourselves as something separate from the whole we call the universe." This is actually an optical delusion of our consciousness. It's like a prison for us. Our task is to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. This striving for such an achievement is a path to our liberation and the only true foundation of our inner peace and security. That was Albert Einstein. So thank you very much.
A new clinical trial shows the active ingredient in the recreational drug ecstasy has promising results when it comes to treating post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Our Dr. John LaPook explains.
Devastated by PTSD, in 2006, Jonathan Lubecki tried to take his own life.
I put a loaded 9mm to my temple and I pulled the trigger. That was the first suicide attempt that I had. I've had a total of 5.
After his last attempt in 2013, the Iraq war veteran began participating in a clinical trial of MDMA, the active ingredient in ecstasy, during sessions with specially trained therapists.
I don't know, I feel normal again, if that makes any sense.
My world changed. This therapy is the sole reason that my son has a father instead of a folded flag.
Lubecki says he's now living a life free from PTSD.
MDMA mutes the amygdala, which is your fight or flight response. Your emotions stay in this happy medium range that they need to be in for the therapy to work.
Research organization MAPS PBC first began clinical trials of MDMA in 2003. It announced the findings of its latest trials this month.
88% of the people had clinically significant decrease in their PTSD symptoms. 67% of them lost their PTSD diagnosis.
MAPS PBC plans to submit its results for publication and, later this year, ask the FDA to approve MDMA as a prescription medication in combination with therapy.
So if somebody says to you, you're talking about ecstasy, a recreational drug, what would you say?
It's being administered in a very particular manner by people that are quite well trained. We are not suggesting that anyone try this on their own at home in their living room.
No flashbacks, no panic attacks, no anxiety.
Lubecki is finishing his third humanitarian aid mission to Ukraine.
Everyone said PTSD can't be cured. I'm living proof that that isn't true.
And Dr. John LaPook joins us now with more. Dr. LaPook, what are the theories behind this drug's effectiveness?
Well, it's interesting. They are theories, right? And the first thing is that the drug is not to be used alone. It's not like you should say, oh, I'm going to take some ecstasy and then my PTSD is going to go away. It's done in concert with therapy. It's pharmaceutical grade. It's not what you get on the street where you're not sure what you're getting. So that's key. One of the theories is that, you know, Jonathan Lubecki talked about it dampening the fear center, the amygdala. And so it allows you with therapy to discuss these very tough memories, right? But this time, instead of associating them with fear, the volume is turned down on the fear. And now, remember about these theories now about memory is that you're retrieving the memory, you then rewrite it to your hard disk, to your brain. This time, when you write the memory back to your hard disk, it's associated with less fear. I mean, it's really an amazing, yeah.
So you're basically able to dial it back for yourself, right? You're able to dial yourself back from the fear so that you can reconnect with the experience and kind of process it?
Yeah. So, you know, and I said, what does it feel like? He said, it feels like being hugged or licked by 1,000 puppies, you know, and very vulnerable. That's what he said to me. It's like, imagine that. he said, you know, he felt very vulnerable. He loved the person he was with. He felt trusting. And so now instead of having this kind of response, you're able to be open. You get the therapy is so important. And then you have the pharmaceutical effect to sort of turn down that area of the brain, which gets you revved up with a lot of fear. I would just end by saying this. There's a lot of exciting stuff ahead. You know, for years, the thought of using things like psilocybin, which can be used for, you know, various problems. I had a patient who had very bad ovarian cancer fear, and then the psilocybin, we did a piece about that it really helped relieve her fear. We're having this now with MDMA. I think now the handcuffs are off. We're being able to now finally experiment with these and do the trials the way they're supposed to in a controlled setting. And I think I'm very hopeful for the future to see what kind of effects we can see and what kind of benefits we can have from these psychotropic, so-called psychedelic drugs.
Dr. John LaPook, thank you as always for your reporting.
Take care.
And just this morning, as I was driving the freeway, and my iPhone said, "I'm not going to tell you where to turn off." And I thought, I'm at the mercy of this little object whose electromagnetic radiations are slowly destroying either my brain or my crotch, depending on where I'm keeping it. So I pulled over, and we had a talk. And I explained that this was really an important group to talk to. And it said, I'll give you an alternate route that the other map app won't know. So it's nice to be here. And just to be clear, how many of you have never had any psychedelic experience? Okay. Oh, it's wonderful. I rarely meet you. And of those of you who kept your hands down, how many of you have experienced microdosing? Okay. Now, one of the things that you have noticed is that there's no science yet, just worldwide use. Though there is something I call citizen science, which is the thousands and thousands of people who have talked to each other and helped each other, as well as the mushroom companies who write me thank you notes for all the kits they're selling. So a microdose of a psychedelic, and I'll just use the term microdose from here on, is a 1/10 to a 20th of the amount one would take if one were having a recreational dose. If one's talking about a transformational dose, we're really dealing with much higher numbers. But we're talking approximately 10 micrograms of LSD, between 1/10 of a gram and 4/10 of a gram of mushrooms, and you can take it from there. The discovery, and like everything else, when you deal with the natural world and with the plant world, it's always rediscovery by ignorant white people. That's our system. But for me, the discovery was Robert Fort told me that Albert Hoffman had told him about a low dose. And I thought that was interesting. My entire career has been with relatively high doses. You know, if it isn't transcendence and you don't vanish as a being and you're not one with all things, I'm not that interested. So what does the universe do for me? It says, why don't you look at the absolute other end? at the most boring use of psychedelics ever created. No mystical visions, no snakes eating you alive, no angelic being saying, "You're really special." And everyone else is too, but you can't hear that. So microdosing, it turns out, makes you feel better. And as Eilert's great book says, it's called a really good day. And those of you who have not microdosed have had really good days, so you know what I'm talking about. Now, the first question was, why does this little teeny bit have any effect at all? And one of the nice things is there's research. And there's a lot of research on very low and microdoses. There's a book coming out in a couple of weeks called The Science of Microdosing. And the research is all very clear, there are no effects below 25 mics. Now, the problem with all that research is that they were looking only for what we would call classic psychedelic effects. So they missed everything else. But being good scientists, they said there are no effects, rather than here are the things we looked for and there weren't those. Would have been a little more correct. The other problem, the other question was, given how amazing microdosing is, and I'll go into it in a little bit, why hadn't we been noticing, at least for the past 50 years? Because remember, most LSD work in the world comes in two phases. One, up till the government stopped it, and it was the most researched psychiatric drug on the planet, several thousand research papers. Then there was the period of enormous use, which is, at least in the United States, since it became illegal, 26 million Americans have tried LSD. And that figure goes up 400,000 to 600,000 each year, no matter what's going on in the drug world. But nobody was paying attention to microdoses. Well, curiously, I was going back to what Sandoz had done, because in the good old days, you wrote Sandoz and they sent you some LSD and said, tell us how you're using it. And the government, if you were doing it that way, gave you an exemption to do that and you were on your way. Sandoz only provided LSD in ampules, that's a little bit of glass with a little bit of liquid, 25 mics, or tablets, 25 mics. No one ever considered that there was anything else below that. Well, there is. And in fact, there's a lovely thing which you might just think about with other pharmaceuticals you may have been given. Albert Hofmann said on the package, when Sandoz sent it out, it said, before you give this to anyone else, you must use it yourself. Now that's packaging. But of course, what happened in many cases is you used it yourself and you said, why am I going to give this, right, to a bunch of overweight sophomores to see if their blood sugar changes? Now, the nice thing about microdosing is it's been used for thousands of years by indigenous people. And this was brought home to me in a very somewhat embarrassing way. I was feeling Jim the Explorer had discovered this new way and was promulgating it fairly wildly. And an anthropologist said to me, did it ever occur to you that indigenous people might have tried small doses, given that they've tried every other level of dose? And I said, until you mentioned it. And then when you begin to look really carefully at some, even of the anthropologists, they have a little throwaway line. There's a 1977 article about the Huichol in National Geographic. And it says they consider peyote a major sacrament, and they use it to make it easier to have long, hot walks, to have visions and to see their gods. And I thought, well, those are dosage levels. Because some of you may know that if you took a fairly large dose of LSD or peyote, you would not take a long, hot walk. You might lie in the sun and hope that your eyeballs don't get burned out. So low doses are out there, and obviously in any hunting and gathering society, South America, hunters really do a lot better with something that increases stamina, increases visual acuity, and increases the willingness to focus very, very carefully for long amounts of time. So it's an obvious use. But what happened is I started asking people, would you be interested in trying this very low dose? And like some of you, I have a lot of friends who said, oh, sure, man. That's cool, yeah. I haven't tried that. How about next week? I'm kind of stoned this weekend with something higher. So I began to get reports. And the first reports were, yes, there were effects. And that was, at that moment, rather exciting. Then I kept asking people, and then people would ask people, and then people who didn't know me would ask people, and I began to get reports from other countries and from people I wouldn't normally meet. And I began to compile the lists of things they said it helped. And it began to get very puzzling. And let me read you a list. And most of this is from 2015. This is things that were improved by the use of 10 micrograms or slightly less every third day. The kind of protocol I suggested for exploration, and for exploration only, was 1 day on and 2 days off. By the way, that's become, and I read about it, the Fadiman protocol, in which your entire life is now committed to that schedule. I only asked people to do it for a month and said, do what you want after that and let me know. And it turns out, after a month, most of the people in our sample, and we're talking thousands, do it less often. So turns out its major addictive properties are vastly overblown. So what does it help? Anxiety? Not general anxiety, not if you're just anxious, but academic anxiety, party anxiety, social anxiety. Asperger's? More ease in social situations. And people who are kind of serious, because most Asperger's people are fairly serious and also like to keep really good records, they tend to want to take more than that for the same effect that for the rest of us 10 is enough. Bipolar, mood elevation during the depression, which is most people, we recommend not doing something during your manic phase, and usually you're perfectly happy not to. My favorite in the early ones was no post-Burning Man crash. And as this young woman wrote, a first. Creativity, this is technical creativity, coding, machine design, a lot of others. Recently, we've been looking at concussions. And maybe we'll have time to get back to that, but if not, we'll take it in the question time. But concussions turn out to often are alleviated in many ways with microdosing. And that's something I want to really do a study on. People stopped using or decreased their use of coffee, cigarettes, Adderall, a lot of antidepressants. And what people now write in, they say, oh, I'm on this horrible pharmaceutical, I want to microdose, I write back, the word is taper. The word withdrawal, by the way, does not appear in the pharmaceutical literature. But how you get off something is to take less and less and less of it, because most of the antidepressants are incredibly addictive, as some of you unfortunately know. Ice pick headaches. That's a headache where it feels like there's an ice pick going into your eye. They take about 1 minute, but they can be alleviated in a couple of seconds with a microdose. The long version of that is called a cluster headache. Usually that takes a much higher dose of psychedelics, but a number of people have reported that microdosing solved their clusters as well, and we'd like to look at that. One of the things that you look for when you're getting these reports is changes that nobody asked for, because those are really interesting. In general, when people are microdosing, they improve their health habits. Food choices, exercise, yoga, meditation. Early on, a wonderful guy who used to write about 2,500 words a day to me, I know a lot about him, and his children and his ex-wife and so on. But he was a junk food kind of guy when he wasn't smoking dope. And he said, I looked at the menu, and by God, I wanted the salad. So what I want you to get out of that is these changes in habits are not by willpower. They seem to occur as an effect. There are no, by the way, there are no side effects. There are only effects of things. Learning, languages, advanced math. A lot of people said I was much better able to focus in class. Even my lousy teachers got interesting. And a couple of people have said I was able to look at the PowerPoint once and then just make notes. I didn't have to keep going back and forth. And people basically talked about better grades and easier exams and so forth. One of the ones that was wonderful, because you just don't think psychedelics, menstrual periods. Troubling emotional or physical PMS. A lot of people are reporting improvements to the extent of from horrible to normal. And we have a little sub-study going on that. Physical skills, musical instruments, drumming, composition, flying a plane, driving. Trauma, this is not going to eliminate trauma, but it seems to decrease the triggering. And one of the ones that is peculiar was much less procrastination. And when I looked at this, I thought, that's really cool. But then I thought, oh my God, what if the pharmaceutical industry sees this and decides that procrastination is a disease? They'll be out there. A few people improved in stuttering, writer's block. A lot of journalists who've done articles on microdosing indicate that it's great for first drafts. And there are two groups of journalists. Ones who would write, I microdosed for a month and then I talked to this guy. The others were, I talked to this guy and then afterwards, I wrote him that I was microdosing. And people basically have improved work, amount, discrimination, flow, quality. They also indicate that they're more comfortable with those awful people at work. They're also, I have a couple of notes that say, boy, if people knew that what it did for your libido, you would have a product. We haven't seen that as a generalization, but you're welcome to check it out. So what happened with this research is we started reporting it. We reported at MAPS, reported in Prague and England, Berlin, and most recently, a few weeks ago at Horizon. And what happened at the same time was what you might call a media feeding frenzy, which is, there was one article and then there were 8 articles that either quoted it or just stole it. And then there was just an endless round of articles until every magazine had to have had their microdosing article. And each article, of course, led to more people trying it. And more people trying it would write to our site, microdosingpsychedelics.com, that's with a plural, psychedelics, and they would sign in for information and join our study. And the study was, take it for a month, every couple of days. And since we were now doing a more formal study, tell us about your emotional states for the prior month, tell us why you want to microdose, and then of course, we can see from your numbers what happens. And what happens in general is that, and we used a very standard instrument called PANAS, it's positive and negative affect states. And we picked a very general, well-known instrument so people wouldn't say, why didn't you use a general, well-known instrument? It's not that great. But what it basically said is, when people are microdosing, their positive emotions go up and their negative emotions decline. Now, antidepressants, for the few of you they work for, have a partial similar effect. They tend to make negative emotions go down, which is you are much better able to stand being unhappy. Microdoses work differently, which is you not only are less unhappy, but you're more happy. And that's remarkable. And as the media frenzy continued, and it continues to this day, right now there's a little sub-unit on Reddit of 20,000 people talking to each other about microdoses. If you go to the YouTube, the highest single and not bad how to microdose has 600,000 hits. There's a group called the Third Wave, that's one word, thirdwave.com, who give classes on how to microdose and are generally setting up kind of friendship units, kind of like psychedelic societies around. There's also a lovely guy in England who sells you a microdose kit. In case you don't know how to measure 10 micrograms. He also includes sterile gloves. And I think it's in even a little wooden box. It's really quite lovely. Well, and because of this huge interest, and our sample is from 59 countries. So when I say one of the things I've learned is psychedelics are available worldwide. And what's my time? Okay. I got to tell you just one story then. I got a letter from Namibia. Okay, everyone who knows they could immediately go to a map and put their finger on Namibia, don't raise your hands, you'll embarrass the people around you. He had, again, those of you who know psychedelics, he had shingles. Shingles, if you don't take care of them, for some people, it's basically pain. It's pain, pain, pain. This was his third month. He was no longer pretty much sleeping. I mean, it was terrible. He'd done all the things you can do if you start too late. He'd never had any psychedelic experience, and he wrote, he said, but I had a friend in the capital who had some mushrooms, and I just thought it might be a good idea. So this is why I think, divine plays with us. 45 minutes later, he was out of pain. That's what I said, woo. And I was so excited, I wrote him back and other things. I was so excited because I wanted to tell my colleague, Sophia, who was presenting in Prague. And when she got back to the States, I called her and, I'm going to tell you this terrific story. And I said, shingles. She said, in Prague, 2 women came up to me, hugged me and wept. And I said, yeah. She said, shingles. Now, those of you who are into neuroanatomy and brain chemistry and all the things that have not actually proved very useful yet, but you get those great pictures, you can figure out why 10 micrograms of LSD can help shingles. And I'll give you one more, even geekier one. This is a negative. This is people who shouldn't microdose. People with red-green color blindness. Some of you may know what a tracer is. Those of you that don't, when you take a regular psychedelic, you see a light source and you move your eye away and there's a little thin line of light that follows you. It's a tracer. People with red-green blindness, with color blindness, with microdosing, have those tracers for days. Because we had a few of them in our study and they all dropped out, and Sophia wrote them and said, why'd you drop out? And they said, tracers. And Sophia, being a real scientist, she said, let me talk to you, Jim, in a couple of days. So in a couple of days, she said, I had a friend who has red-green blindness. Yes, it's true. She called him, would you please microdose? Yes, there are tracers. What we're doing now, so it's out there. We've explored the island. The event space of microdosing has come into being. It's like exploring a tropical island. There's just all kinds of things in it that we don't understand, but they're there. The next thing that happens first there's the people who say, I don't believe anything, actually even the sunrise, unless there's a double-blind study. And they always, at the end of an article, someone says, well, there hasn't been a double-blind study. How do we know that all these thousands of people, it isn't just a placebo? One of our many subjects wrote in and said, I don't care if it's a placebo. I haven't felt this good in 20 years. And I just loved them to do the one on shingles and see if there's a placebo. But anyway, what's happening is there are 12 countries in which the usual correct double-blind cross, blah, 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 studies are starting. Canada, New Zealand, maybe even the USA. It's a little harder because it's costly if you have to keep watching people. And in the US, as someone said, it's very hard to talk to our university and say, we'd like to give people a Schedule I drug every couple of days and just let them go home. And the university says, if I say no, what's it going to cost me? If I say yes, what could it cost me? So anyway, 12 other countries are working on it. And we were about to go out of business. And then we thought, what could we do that nobody else can do? Well, we have thousands of people who have microdosed, and we have enough of their information. And they've microdosed up to maybe a year and a half ago. But we only asked them to tell us for a month, and many of them didn't tell us that long. So we are asking approximately 8,000 people to tell us what were the long-term effects for you if you microdosed, if you stopped, how often you do it, what's going on now. Because we're the only group that can really do that because we have this huge base to start from. And that will actually be better data than is available for most pharmaceuticals. Little dirty secret. Most pharmaceutical research does not go beyond 6 months. That which you have been taking for 15 years, no data. So we're trying to move things along because it is available. As someone pointed out, mushrooms do not know they're illegal. And that's probably what we're going to stop with because there's so many people now that want to do the research and they're in positions to do so. And the first group did a beautiful little study in Amsterdam. There was a meeting of a psychedelic society and the researchers said, would you mind if we made this a research evening? Everybody gets a little bit of truffle. Psychedelic truffle is actually, it's a mushroom that just grows underground. And for peculiar reasons, it's legal, more legal than the mushroom. So people took some intelligence kind of tests, and then they truffled. Might as well make up a verb when you have a moment. And then later in the evening, they took the tests again. Super clean research called open source, so they knew. And it turned out, of the 3 kinds of intellectual activity they were looking at, 2 improved and 1 didn't. It's a very beautiful, clean research, and what's wonderful is it took about 3 hours to get the data. See, my friends in the hard science world, they do a study, and you've read some of them. 12 subjects. How long did it take you to get the subjects? A year. What it cost? $80,000. And I say, well, I've got 5,000 to 10,000 subjects, and it costs awfully little, particularly at my salary. And we have a whole different way of doing science, which is called citizen science, which is you find out, you tell us, you help other people. We now have a few things where we say don't use microdosing, as I say, for anxiety, color blindness, very few else. And that's where we're going. So that we are returning to the indigenous model, which is you work with people you know, and you work with people in your own life, and you find out how something works. And if it's the nice thing about microdosing, if it doesn't work, you stop. If it's unpleasant in any way, you stop. And that's the end of it. So I'll see some of you later, and for the rest of you, this is really an amazing event. Just amazing, and I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
The default mode network activates when a person is introspective, and under normal circumstances becomes less active when a person shifts their attention to the outside world. But brain studies show that under the influence of a psychedelic, the default mode network is quieted, while other regions of the brain increase communication with each other. A mathematical model captures a normal brain's activity. In contrast, a brain under the influence of psilocybin reveals a dramatic increase in global communication. Thousands of new connections form, linking brain regions that don't normally talk to each other.
One analogy I've used for how psychedelics work in the brain is this snow globe. When you pick up a snow globe, the snow's settled at the bottom, it's sort of fixed, and then you pick it up, shake it, and things jiggle around, and there's randomness and a kind of chaos, if you want, in the system.
The user experiences this as an altered and heightened sense of awareness. But what causes this?
Early in our functional brain imaging studies of psychedelics, scientists were finding that the default mode network was turning down or turning off during these experiences. And that was a really good place to start. But we began to then look one layer deeper. Why was the default mode network turning off?
New research led neuroscientist Fred Barrett to investigate a region of the brain called the claustrum.
The claustrum is a really thin sheet of gray matter in the brain, tucked deep within each of the hemispheres of the brain. Recent animal models have shown that it is incredibly highly connected to just about every other region of the brain. Understanding that the receptors targeted by psychedelic drugs are also really densely expressed in the claustrum, we began to wonder whether the claustrum may be at the center of psychedelic effects.
Fred believes the claustrum's central location and shape suggest it regulates communication between the departments.
When it's functioning normally, the claustrum is essentially acting like a switchboard. It's trying to help other brain regions figure out when to turn on and when to turn off. But when we experience a psychedelic drug, we believe that it's binding to specific receptors in the claustrum and somehow disrupting or disorganizing the claustrum. It's almost as if the switchboard walks away. What happens next is that we seem to observe a radical change in the way that brain regions talk to each other. And it may be within this context that we're experiencing learning and a possible even rewiring of the circuits that govern our behavior. And it may be that it's that radical reorganization that allows people to encounter new psychological insights that they hadn't encountered before.
Fred thinks the claustrum's sudden abdication of control may help explain why rigid behavior and thought patterns have a shot at resetting.
It's almost like they've seen this like kind of grand menu within their mind that they weren't aware of, that this greater number of possibilities that they can explore.
It took a while to recover. I was having headaches and muscle pains, but it was the best headache I'd ever had in my life because it told me that the psilocybin was working. It was actually physically restructuring my brain, something that I never imagined could happen before.
It's like reprogramming the operating system of a computer. You're getting down to very basic code level changes that can enduringly change someone going forward.
Take MDMA at a common dose while sitting around someone's house, there's almost no chance of an otherwise healthy person being harmed. But if you take a large amount and use it in a different environment, the safety of MDMA can drastically change. A few of the factors that determine how safe the drug is include the dose, how hot the environment is, how much water you're drinking, and how active you are. Depending on how you control those factors, you can end up using MDMA in an almost entirely safe way, or you could put yourself at risk of dying. Before we can even talk about MDMA safety, you first need to be pretty sure that you actually have MDMA. You should never take it without first testing your drug sample using reagent liquids. I've talked about this elsewhere on the Drug Classroom, so I recommend watching my drug checking video for more information. The MDMA market has long been filled with adulterants, some of which are much riskier than MDMA. You always want to make sure your sample is likely to be MDMA before you put it in your body. Even if you do have MDMA, strength is an issue when it comes to tablets. Although the average MDMA tablet has historically contained 100 milligrams or less, that can vary. There are cases of a single tablet containing over 200 and even over 300 milligrams. Those kinds of doses could be very dangerous, especially if you take more than one tablet. There's no simple way to know how much your tablet contains. To reduce your risk, it's wise to take no more than 0.5 to 1 tablet as your initial dose. If possible, there are benefits to taking MDMA in powder or crystal form, since dosing is at least somewhat easier. Many people who end up in the hospital have not just taken MDMA. Instead, they've combined it with other drugs that may have increased the negative effects. Most other drugs that increase serotonin, with the exception of SSRIs, should not be used with MDMA. This includes drugs like MAOIs and 5-HTP. Other stimulants, including cocaine, amphetamines, and even caffeine, also shouldn't be used. And you should also avoid tramadol and DXM. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it covers the key problematic combinations that people tend to use. MDMA has led to medical problems, and rarely fatalities. Those cases can present with symptoms like agitation, seizures, hypertension, hyperthermia, tachycardia, renal failure, and hyponatremia. Three of the biggest issues associated with MDMA are hyponatremia, hyperthermia, and cardiovascular problems. Most of the severe cases involve at least one of those. Although there are multiple things that can go wrong in the body in connection with MDMA use, the way in which you can reduce your risk is pretty much always the same. You need to keep your body temperature down, your sodium level adequate, and your dose reasonable. MDMA disrupts the body's thermoregulation. Even in a calm environment, you can still see your temperature approach hyperthermia. When the drug's inherent pro-hyperthermic property is combined with intense dancing, crowding, and a high ambient temperature, you're creating a recipe for a dangerous response. It's not unheard of for people to surpass 102 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 39 to 40 degrees Celsius. Hyperthermia can contribute to fatal toxicity when it gets too high. I recognize it's not very helpful to say don't take MDMA in clubs or festivals. Realistically, people often won't follow that advice, but I truly would prefer to see people taking MDMA in settings that are more relaxed and are not crowded or hot. If you are using it in a warm and active environment, you can reduce your risk by taking a common dose. An initial dose of 80 to 140 milligrams will be fine for most people. It's best to avoid redosing, but if you insist on using more so that you can potentially lengthen the experience, a single redose with half of the original amount is the safest way to redose. Even when you're not drinking excessively, MDMA can lower your serum sodium level. Based on dose, water consumption, individual differences, and environment, this can lead to hyponatremia, which is a state of particularly low serum sodium. Hyponatremia has the potential to contribute to severe toxicity. Initially, it could lead to symptoms like headache, nausea, muscle cramps, and mental status changes. In severe cases, you could end up with cerebral edema, seizures, and brain herniation. Females may be at an even greater risk of hyponatremia-related complications. Although MDMA can have an inherent effect on sodium, hyponatremia-related complications have mainly occurred due to people drinking excessive amounts of water. If you drink a lot of water, you can further dilute your sodium level, thereby exacerbating the issue. Although drinking water is a good idea, you don't need to use a massive amount. Around 500 milliliters per hour is a fine basic guideline. An even better option is to use isotonic drinks, also known as sports drinks, or you could use sodium tablets or capsules alongside regular water. I think aiming for 200 to 300 milligrams of sodium per 500 milliliters of water is reasonable. MDMA can increase your blood pressure and heart rate, though neither increase is typically an issue in controlled settings. When you're intensely dancing for hours on end, however, that's a different story. It's also going to be a much greater issue if you've taken a large dose. Because of its cardiovascular effects, MDMA can raise the risk of stroke, cerebral hemorrhage, aortic dissection, and acute myocardial infarction. You definitely don't want to encounter any of those. If you have a pre-existing cardiovascular issue, I recommend avoiding the drug. For otherwise healthy people, sticking with a common dose is very important. And, again, low activity settings are better than high activity ones. If you are active, taking a 10-minute break every so often is a good idea. Just to wrap things up, let's review some of the important safety tips. First, have a good idea of what you're taking. You should never use an MDMA product without testing it first. Second, plan out your dose. A good idea for the initial dose is to take your weight in kilograms, divide it by 2, and then add 90. Depending on your body weight, you'll generally get a dose between 100 and 140 milligrams. I recommend only taking one dose, but if you insist on redosing, you should take half your original dose about 2 to 2.5 hours after the first. Third, take breaks every so often. Even spending 10 minutes relaxing away from the crowd every hour or so is useful. At the same time as you're taking a break, you can follow the fourth step, which is to drink a moderate amount of water, around 500 milliliters per hour. It's best to use the water in the form of an isotonic sport drink or with a supplement providing 200 to 300 milligrams of sodium. There are a few things I haven't really discussed here. One is individual differences. Genetic differences, such as with the CYP2D6 and CoMT enzymes, could put someone at a greater risk of acute problems with MDMA. Also, there are some other safety issues with liver and kidney health that I didn't discuss, but the tips in this video will help the majority of people remain relatively safe on the drug. It's important to understand this video only covers the acute safety of MDMA. Chronically taking the drug could result in other problems, and those may be counteracted through other means. I discussed potential neuroadaptations and neurotoxicity from chronic MDMA use in another video. If you're interested in the evidence for those issues and how you might be able to reduce your risk, I recommend watching the video. If you want to learn more, I recommend visiting the Drug Classroom website using the link in the description. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. The Drug Classroom is exclusively funded by donations. If you'd like to support, please do so on patreon.com/thedrugclassroom.
Remember, there is always only one truth. You get to know that by following and subscribing.